When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, the profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hey, this is Jon Langmead. I'm the author of Ballyhoo, Roughhousers, Con Artists, and Wildmen who invented professional wrestling. You're with Crazy Train Radio. Long live pro wrestling.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
So, this next guest has been writing about music, pop culture, and he's even dabbled a little bit with professional wrestling, which we will get into, for various outlets, including PopMatters, Aquarium Drunkard, Slam Wrestling, and North Carolina Indy Week, just for a few examples. His latest project, Ballyhoo, the Roughhousers, Con Artists, and Wildmen who invented professional wrestling, which happens to be his first book. Let's welcome Jon Langmead. How are you doing, sir? And how do you pronounce that properly?
You pretty good. Langmead. You were in the right in the ballpark. It's darn
Speaking
close.
of mead, I'm gonna pour another mead. Dr. Mike Lano is with us. You connected this whole thing together as I pour some mead for myself. Our guest is from the San Francisco area, and folks who are familiar with you know you spent time in San Fran for personal and professional. So do you want to mention anything?
Well, that's kind of what I loved about the book. It starts right off And the term ballyhoo, for people that don't know, if you look it up, there's several: flamboyantly, exaggeratedly, extravagantly, noisily, publicity, or publicizing a much, say, a sports extravaganza, for example, or any type of extravaganza. I love this. Overly sensational promotion or publicity, and use of the word is indicated, especially when what you're promoting is not as good or as exciting as you're claiming that to be. We've seen that so much with pro wrestling over the centuries.
Would that definition have been for something they used to call the Webster's Dictionary?
I think that's where that comes from. I'm not going to stand by that last one. I will say that in this case, I think the product was pretty darn good, although you're right, Mike, that
well, the more
from
modern day, the Vince McMahon stuff from like WrestleMania 1, which was it wasn't the greatest card in the world. They were promoting it like it was. There were some squash matches. But I love the San Francisco references. I think the term job in John's book, excellent book, Ballyhoo, the derivation might have started in San Francisco with Curly, the main person in here. But if you are a lover of all of these names, Thez, Farmer Burns, Golden Greek, Jimmy Londos, so many are.
Strangler Lewis is in there.
Yeah, it's just the Stecker brothers, and that's heartwarming in the epilogue, which is worth the price of the book alone. That's where I was at just before emailing John. But and he, he's going into Gorgeous George and the stuff, that gets our teeth. I wanted to say too, I want to talk about some of these names. John, you must know, maybe through Tom Burke or Steve Yohe, et cetera, that two of the many great stooges, there weren't just three, but Jerome, Curly, and Shemp were regulars at the Olympic Auditorium for pro wrestling. This was even before Jules Strongbow's era in the late 30s, 40s, and then we'd see others that would follow. They'd either go a couple of times for whatever PR reasons, like Mae West, Jack Benny, Bing Crosby, Bob Hope. And there's footage of Buddy Rogers standing somewhere. I still haven't seen it, but I keep hearing about it as the Holy Grail, standing next to Nat King Cole playing the Nature Boy song from late 40s, 50s.
That'd be something. I've always heard, in the early days of Cauliflower Alley, the really, really early days of it, that it was a mix of like celebrities and wrestlers and all these things. And I mean, wrestling wasn't, nowadays, it's getting back to it a little bit where celebrities kind of are acknowledging wrestling. But I feel like, at least in the era I'm writing about, the era you're talking about, it was straight up show business, and the show business people had nothing but respect for the wrestlers and their ability to draw crowds.
I'm going to throw to Jonathan in a second, Jonathan of Crazy Train Radio, but I wasn't there for that part, but John Tolis brought me as a wrestling photographer and some of the stuff I'd done in like 86. So I got to work with Iron Mike Mazurki. He wasn't a true founder. Art Abrams and some other guys were. I defer to some other folks, but I know he wasn't, but they decided he would be the face of it because he was a wrestler, actor, TV star. You got to see him in the old, the single season in like 1963 of the Jerry Lewis show. He was a regular. But it was Mike Mazurki who wanted it it was 1/3. So through my era, because I was on the board first in 87 and the event photographer from that year on. It was 1/3 wrestlers, 1/3 boxers, combat sports, and 1/3 entertainers or reel, REEL. And each year we would give a reel award to folks like Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, many other stars. Terry Moore, who was married, she was a movie star in the King Kong ripoff, but she was married to Howard Hughes. And we lost a lot of that when Carl Lauer, the club VP, after Art Abrams died in 1999, he moved CAC from LA to Vegas, and we lost those other components. We lost because, sometimes the awards now, since we moved to Vegas in 2000, they are spread over 2 nights. We have way too many awards for Cauliflower Alley. But in the past, when I went to all of those great events at the old Spaghetti Factory, and then at Los Angeles Valley at Sportsman's Lodge, where there's a lot of movie stars, we did a ton of wrestling awards, a ton of boxing awards, and a ton of film stars, and even a few roller derby awards in one night. But now the wrestling awards are all spread, so it's now just still, occasionally every 2 or 3 years we might have a movie star like the Clint Howard or something like that come. But in the 90s, we'd have Elliot Gould came several times. We'd have the cast of Spanky, the Little Rascals that were still alive. It was quite amazing. Marion Ross was at 2 from Happy Days, the mom from Happy Days, and so on. So Jonathan, let me throw to you.
All right. Thank you, sir. So want to mention the book is printed by University of Missouri Press, which has a lot of great products. And to give a lump sum about it, because we want people to buy the book, but we'll obviously be talking about it today. John follows the formative period, I guess you would say, of professional wrestling coming out of the carnivals from roughly, 1874, which is about almost a decade out of the Civil War. Sorry, the history degree's coming out. Leading into the early 40s, which we were in the midst of World War II. But this period certainly contested the interplay of wrestlers and promoters who built the business to what we know today. So my first obvious question, John, is why did you decide to take such a deep dive to put this project together?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So it's about 1870 to 1940 is the era that it covers. And, I don't know. I mean, I knew I wanted to write something about pro wrestling. I mean, I had been, Mike may not remember this, but
right. He was born in 1643, but.
Right. No, yeah.
William Muldoon fighting the Civil War. When
I first started thinking, something that I wanted to write. I wanted to write something. I think I may have gotten 3 or 4 interviews with him, and I think I bugged him to death. But as time went on, I was originally wanted to do something set, maybe in the 70s or 80s of the 1970s or 80s. But I just kept coming back to the formative era there. And I just felt like that book hadn't quite been written yet. I felt like a really entertaining way. And I know that some of the names sound, musty and old, and the era sounds musty and old. But I think what I was really hoping to do, and for me, to me, that era is not all that different from wrestling of today. And I just feel like, what they were doing and what those men and some women, built and invented, it has stood really a strange kind of test of time. Like it's really endured the model that they built. And it was interesting to kind of follow some of the shifts from, when it was just sort of these rogue athletes traveling around the country to when it was really became like a business dominated by these promoters who would sort of run particular cities, which is obviously the prototype for what became the territories. But while I was doing all that kind of thinking about it, that name that just kept coming up was Jack Curley, and, over and over and over and over again. And then I just got really interested in his life. And then it became just a way that you could hang the whole story around his life. And that's what kind of I set out to do. And hopefully it's entertaining.
Well, and I know Mike mentioned during his epilogue there, Jack Curley, as you just did. For those who aren't familiar with the name Jack Curley, he was a boxing promoter whose fortune took a turn for the better when he began promoting wrestling matches at places you may or may not be familiar with, such as Madison Square Garden. And it was at a different location at the time. It's changed locations. But there's just a lot to deal with Jack Curley. Like you said, that the running thread goes his life and just the evolution, I guess is the word I'm looking for, of the business. So as we were joking, or not joking, but mentioning there's Ed Strangler Lewis, Frank Gotch, the Masked Marvel, Jim Londos, Gorgeous George, just so many people who were founding fathers. Luther is an aspect of more of a modern era between generations there, being the NWA champion. And I'm sure Mike knows the story I just heard a little while ago about Chris Candido and Luthez, but
tell it. I don't know that one. And I knew Chris since before he started in pro, and Lou I worked under. He was our CAC, probably our best CAC president. I put Bachwinkle and Red Bastien closely behind.
Okay, so the story I heard, and you could take it for what it's worth because it's the internet, but supposedly when Chris won the NWA title, or the form of the NWA title in '94 there, I guess he might have been working with your old pal Dennis Corlozzo at the time.
Yeah, he promoted that show where he won the title. It was a tournament.
Okay, so long story short, somewhere after that, they were at a show or something that Lou Thez was invited to. And so Chris, as you would normally do traditionally, not only in life, but especially in the wrestling business, went up to introduce himself. And, yeah, hey, Mr. Thez, I'm Chris Candino. I actually just won the NWA belt. And, Lou introduces himself and says, oh, kid, by the way, keep an eye out for those to protect yourself and those shooters.
I've actually heard that. I can second that story. I have heard that story.
So
I've got photos I took of Lou, not just with Candido, but Danny Severn at our Tampa ancillary CAC meeting in 1995 that Ella Waldeck, one of those female pioneers. And that's a point to buying Ballyhoo. If you want to read a little bit about a guy who would have been canceled in this era. I can only imagine both Johns, how Billy Wolf, what would he have been like had he had been living and promoting in the era of Vince McMahon Sr., for example, or even Jr., who carries on. Vince Jr. carried on.
You're talking Billy Wolf that was involved with like Moolah and stuff, right?
Way before that. Yeah, both
Mildred's husband.
Yeah, there was a crossover with Billy and Moolah, and that's why I'm.
Yeah, not a nice guy at all. No. Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, in one of the reviews of your book, is it Jeff Lean? Was he Mildred Burke's son who did the book on her?
Not her son, but he's an investigative reporter at the Washington Post and has written on a lot of topics. But he did write the Mildred Burke biography, Queen of the Ring, which is getting turned into a movie, as a matter of fact. And they're going to be doing a lot of the characters from that. Billy Wolf, Jack Pfeffer. I don't know when that's coming out, but
I think Jim Ross is a producer of that, Mike.
Yeah, it sounds right. I'll say, Jonathan, back to what we were kind of joking about with Lou Thez, that was what I was really interested in. Is we sort of laugh about it now, right? The idea that someone would shoot on a professional wrestler, right?
In the 90s and
right. But where Lou, even when Lou was wrestling, Mike, you can correct me, but I don't know how likely it was even at that point. It was probably pretty unlikely. But my thinking, a lot of what I was going into this is, how did that happen, right? Like, how do you build a staged sport? And that's really the issue that Jack Curley and these guys were kind of wrestling with, is how do you take control of this thing and organize these athletes and build a sport that's exciting, that can draw people week after week after week. And that's what they did. And the model that they built is distinct.
But so many guys, like, for example, Lou would normally pick the guy he would drop to, as Bruno did, particularly with Koloff, and lobbied for Koloff to Vince Sr., as he told me a zillion times. But Lou, let's take Dick Hutton, was a guy who could defend himself if, need be. You've heard like Flair talk about going into, I forget what the South American country was, working. He was supposed to have gone over Jack Bonanno, but instead.
It was the Caribbean. You're thinking of.
Caribbean, yeah. He dropped it because he could tell that they would kill him had he gone over Jack. And Ric Flair was he was just a performing wrestler the way Buddy Rogers was, not a hooker shooter the way Thez, Gagne, Billy Robinson, Bert Asariti, Stu Hart, Great Malenko, Larry Simon, and Dr. Big Bill Miller. If I've dropped or missed anybody, I'm sorry there. That's like it. Who ever had his hooker shooters. So it kills me that Karl Gotch was never, they never put a world title on him. I think the closest he got was in Inoki's New Japan, where he was a god on par with Thez, at least.
I got a good hooker shooter story that it was kind of joked around. I got to tell real quick before I'm getting sidetracked, as we usually do. Because Mike knows I went down to Atlantic City to try to meet up with Bret Hart, because he was doing a show down there to get my autobiography signed. It's up on the top shelf there. And that show, the Atlantic City Con, was a complete cluster. And Bret didn't get paid and all that. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of story not going to get into now, so he didn't show up from the hotel room. But where we were standing, waiting for the for him to come down, not knowing any of the behind the scenes bullshit at the time, looking out this glass window of because this venue was built across from Caesar's hotel, and you could see anyway glass windows, 3-story building off. And I was talking to a fan from Colorado Springs. And, she was a fan of the Hearts and different things like that. I said, you see that building right across the way there, across the boardwalk? She goes, yeah, why? I said, that's where WrestleMania 4 and 5 were held. She goes, oh, really? But the thing that stood out with the hooker shooter was the famous Owen Hart prank phone call to Stu, who was staying in Brett's room, calling as Reg Parks, who was later on built he was a hooker shooter, but he made belts later on for like the WWF and such. Mm-hmm. So anyway, long story short, when Owen was messing with Stu on the phone as Reg, he would go, I always wanted to try you, Stu. So Stu would say, if you wanted to try me, Reg, you should have tried me, which Owen just lost it and goes, Dad, it's me. And from Brett's perspective, Stu slams the phone down because they were just getting up first thing in the morning a whole bit. But he saw his dad, like the temperature getting red and his face on. He goes, Brett goes, what was that all about? What's going on? Stu looks up after a second, takes a breath and goes, Owen, that little bastard got me.
Well, I got to talk a little bit with Charlie Fez, who was Lou's, widow now. But some of her insights about how I think once you're in that world, it never goes away. The instinct to prove yourself and the instinct to go up against people and see, who's the better man, sort of, or better person, and it's not something I'm sure if you're a 70 or 80 or 90-year-old shooter, you probably still have it a little bit.
Hence Lou with Candido, even in the 90s when everything opened up and stuff, saying, hey, kid, keep an eye out for yourself.
Right. But and that was something too, I think I wanted to try to bring out if I could, because I tried to keep kind of I don't know if I'd say humorous, but I would say respectful, but also, acknowledging the fact, like, look, it's a show, like I think you can only be so kind of serious about the competitive nature of this, but it is, deadly serious. And in that era, some of those guys were some of those early hookers, there's stories of them killing people accidentally in the ring. And I'm sure it was accidental, but it did happen. And it was not a thing you entered into lightly, because it could get dangerous for sure.
Well, there's the Buddy Rogers getting his ass kicked, like in a closet by Dr. Big Bill Miller and Carl Gotch, that great story. He was famous for abusing jobbers, particularly in Vince McMahon Sr.'s Capital Sports, which was why Bruno left over disagreements and all that stuff with Vince Sr.
When he went to Toronto?
Well, he got blackballed. Yeah. He was on a show, and both Bruno and Roy Shires told me this. I had them both on the phone at the same time, my old TV show, Canvas Cavity. And Bruno kept going to different places to work. And once he'd left Vince Sr. over the Rogers thing and whatever it was, I forget, it was early 61. And then he's booked, he's all dressed, he's ready to go out to the main event against Ray Stevens or Roy Shire. And Roy tells him, I just got the call from Vince McMahon Sr., can't use you.
And the athletic commission and all that bullshit.
That's what led to him going up to Toronto for 2 years. And then when Rogers wasn't working as champion and drawing, Vince Sr. went up there and begged Bruno to come back. He's in all these main events. He's drawing record houses for Tunney in Toronto. And that was the same ire that Bruno had that Bill Miller and Carl Gotch had for Rogers. And those guys were big hooker shooters, amongst the best we've ever had on this planet. And we don't really have their likes anymore. I don't know. Who would you consider, John? Of course, we're talking to Jon Langmead, author Ballyhoo, It's got 1 billion 5-star ratings. And the one rating I saw on Amazon, the guy said it's the greatest book he's lauding this guy, but he only gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Come on.
Don't get me started. I saw that one.
Five-star friggin' book.
God damn. It wasn't long enough, I think, was his criticism.
It must have been Cornet Dan, damn it.
Maybe it was. So, I will say, I'll say to that, one thing I was thinking a lot about with the book and how, again, this idea of trying to tell a story is what I was really taken by is Curly's life really has this natural arc to it. He depending, he would never admit this, but he set out to build a fake sport that he could control, basically, and that was his goal. And that was the goal of these promoters, to work together to control this sport. And they're successful. They build that in the 30s. They get Jim Londos in, who was by many accounts a great athlete, a great wrestler in a lot of ways. They have this massive success. Then they kind of aim to replace him with Dan O'Mahony and continue this success, and they're having some measure of that. But Dick Schickett kind of comes along and spoils all this, by beating O'Mahony in the ring. And that was what, for me, I was talking, you all, I'm sure Steve Yohe. I was with him and talking, and we were just going through some photos and talking about stuff. And there's the photo that's in the book of when Schickett actually gets O'Mahony, in this kind of arm bar type hold. And, this is in front of 10,000 people or whatever it is in Madison Square Garden at a main event, and he's pushing his face down in the mat. You can only kind of imagine what's going through O'Mahony's mind at the time. And you're just like, that's how real this is. He's humiliated this guy in front of 10,000 people. He's completely dominated him, and he's in excruciating pain. That's how real this was at certain points. He's telling him, either you submit or I'm going to break your arm. It's kind of like, that's a hell of a choice to have to make in front of 10,000 people. But yeah, so that's the stakes really during that time, and what those promoters were kind of trying to get a handle of. And eventually they were able to do that in the sport we've got today.
Tell us about your process, because this book is researched like nothing else I've seen. I mean, the epilogue is a reason to buy the book. The bibliography, the notes to the epilogue, you have everything possible. The index is amazing, and so it's like, I give it 10 stars just for all of this work. But what was your process? How long did it take you to do this? And the research is down to the letter. What an amazing job you've done.
Thank you. I mean, I'll say it probably took around 5 or 6 years of focusing on this era. And I'll give credit to start before, really, I said this right before we got started, but without, Steve Yohe, without Tim Hornbaker, without Greg Oliver and Steve Johnson and all those guys, Tom Burke, I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, Scott Teal, all of them, it just wouldn't exist, because they've done, Steve's book on Ed Strangler. Lewis was a real template for me to jump off of. Obviously, Tim's book on Capital Wrestling, to build on some of the research that's in there. And then, again, trying to apply what I was hoping would be some really entertaining storytelling, and then filling in the blanks on Jack Curley. But I feel like they really laid the groundwork. I do think in some cases I use some of the same sources, not all the same. I mean, there was a lot of original stuff in there, but I was pulling different stuff out of it sometimes. And one thing I really tried to find was I wanted to put this as much as possible in the words of the people that lived it. So I really tried to find kind of quotes directly from Ed Lewis and the promoters that I could kind of insert into there to tell the story and try to bring their voice to life a little bit. Because I think when you hear the name Joe Stecker, it's like it's just the guy's name in a book, and you don't really get a sense of who Joe was. But when you kind of can you hear what he actually was saying and some of the experiences he was kind of going through. He gets married at a certain point. He's got his wife with him on some of his travels. He has this kind of, he's got this mental illness towards the end of his life that he's dealing with. He may have tried to commit suicide a couple times. Like, it brings, his story to life a little bit. And that's really what I was hoping I could do, not just with Joe Stecker, but with all of them to the degree that I could.
I love when you talked about Tony bringing Fez and some guys to sort of cheer up his brother who was in that institution. And then Lou said, these guys that are like ripped, he was just eating them alive. And yeah. It was great mental therapy, positive therapy for him. it was, really a shame. And before you came aboard, I was remembering, like, in the depended on the promotion, but us in LA, my home base territory, shooting ringside for the program, every program would have for a number of years that whole history, that history of the. It really wasn't. It was a worked history. The NWA from like 1895 on through.
Right.
I don't know. They went through. The real thing really started in 1950 with the court cases and all of that. But they kind of went up to current, and then it kind of stopped when a total showman. I'm not criticizing, but Dusty Rhodes. That's when they stopped putting it in various territories promotions. That history of the NWA title.
Hold on, Dusty was a showman?
He was the showman, I think. He was
and he was
shocker there.
And he was amazing because he reminded me at that point, and I know John, the author here, Ballyhoo, that's when he was a fan. That was when actually you look at sort of the more modern day, say post whatever 1950, Happy Humphreys to Haystack Calhoun, and then Andre in the 70s, and then actually Dusty was going from territory to territory. He's based out of Florida and Mid-Atlantic and Atlanta, but he's on Vince Senior's cards. And he came out, he was Roy Shire's very last U.S. champion. And he went to Detroit and had battles with the Sheik. So it was like a touring attraction. We really didn't have, Andre was kind of the quintessential one, but so amazing. And then, of course, Harley Race was the guy who was driving around. He started driving Happy Humphreys around, bathing him by hauling him out and hosing him off. That was a bath for Happy Humphreys.
I'll tell you to that point. I mean, I've written about this in other things where the book came out, but the thing I think that brought the story to life for me, I wanted to bring these guys and tell their story a little bit more was, I mean, I play music, but and the musicians I've known that are professional musicians, their story, it's not that different of a life. You get in a car, you drive around from city to city, you got to do it over and over and over and over again, and you hope each time you come back, there's a few more people than the last time you played there. You've got promoters that are looking to kind of screw you out of money. You just show up, you've got your act, you try to do it the best you can. I mean, and that's what these guys were doing. I mean, they were traveling entertainers with all of the good and bad things that come with that. And that's really, I suspect that's been lost in some ways. Maybe it's good. I don't know if you'd have to ask a wrestler if they're on the road and live that life anymore. And I wouldn't want to do that. But, there was something that was gained there of having to show up and entertain 5,000 people who may or may have never seen you before.
And that's where it's like, and I'll throw back to John, so I'm not hogging airtime. Bully Ray, Bubba Ray Dudley has said this a million times. The place where you learn the most about wrestling is in the car, traveling with other guys, maybe veterans, and you shut up and just listen to them talk, and you absorb that. And that's a big positive gain, at least for the wrestlers. And you look at guys like Cody now; they have their own tour buses like rock stars. He doesn't fly. He's like
right.
John was afraid to fly. He has his own bus that the company pays for, $1 billion bus.
From a musical perspective, Hooker, who they were in a Cadillac going from town to town or whatever, and that's how new people, the tradition was passed on, was they would ride from town to town and they would talk about the music and how you do it and how you not even stuff, and that's how the tradition was kind of passed down. And yeah, you're right, wrestling I think had the same thing. I will say in the book, I think this is kind of the beginning of it. That era was maybe not exactly the beginning, because wrestling obviously was happening before 1870 in America, and certainly other countries too. But the whole idea of what we watch now and what we all experienced through the 80s and 90s, that was really built and codified in that era of like 1920 to 1940. I think it was. Maybe you could argue a little bit with it, but I think that was the idea pretty much.
Yeah.
No, I'd agree with that because of the formation after the war of what we know of the NWA and such. But I'm curious to know, because obviously you mentioned about promoters in general maybe trying to fudge or fuck with the money and such. Shocker, I know, right? And not just musicians, but wrestlers, the whole bit. But what would you say as far as, and I know it's in the book, but at the time we're talking, say, let's go 20s, 30s and whatnot. You had as far as popular sports and probably the most high paid athletes at the time would be wrestling and boxing, popularity wise. But the other sports, baseball and football and all, were just really getting their heels in the ground for what became Major League Baseball and NFL and such. But my question being, when it comes to the money, and even if I ask specific amounts, who gives a shit? The IRS ain't gonna care at this point. But the wrestlers at the time really seemed to be the highest paid athletes and entertainers at the time. But besides that, how did the Depression handle things?
How did the Depression
Fun-wise?
affect things? How did it? Well, I think you're right. I don't know if they were I don't know this. I genuinely don't know if they were the highest paid. I would certainly say a lot of them were making pretty good money.
You'd have occasional folks like, say, a Babe Ruth, but it was as a whole.
As a whole, yeah. And I'll say, and Steve Yohe said this to me, and I think he's exactly right. Is the proof is in the fact that, Frank Gotch owned, vast amounts of land in Iowa. He became like a bank president after he retired. Joe Stecker had all this land and all this stuff that they owned.
Where was Joe Stecker from, by the way?
Nebraska, right?
Okay.
God, I hope I don't get that wrong. I'm pretty sure he's from Nebraska.
Because I used to hunt on a guy's property with the last name Stecker. And
right, yeah, well, the Bisco brothers.
In Jersey, though.
They had hotels, so but that's kind of a clue that there was real money there. These guys were in business and they used their wrestling careers to kind of start these other businesses that they went into. The promoters too, Curly had an estate out on Long Island that he lived in. I mean, he died pretty broke, but it was a real business. And I think people made a living at it, even if you weren't getting rich at it. I mean, and Mike, even, I mean, there were a lot of working wrestlers who lived very well as professional wrestlers, and that's all they did. That's pretty darn hard to do nowadays. Just like it is with
music. There were a lot that they had nothing. Like at the 1991 CAC, there was some guys, it was just painful. These guys were hugely, had amazing careers. Like even Pampero Furco, who I knew and traveled a bit with and stayed in touch with him forever. And then his daughter asked me to be a pallbearer at his funeral. But he lamented that, hey, I was at Madison Square Garden against Pedro and Boston Gardens against Bruno and Pedro and drew sellouts. And now I'm a postal employee. And it was like painful for him. He finally shaved off the long hair and the beard. Just nobody recognized him. And it was kind of hurtful that a guy who was this colorful, legit spoke 7 to 8 languages. I'm not just talking about a few phrases, and was so colorful and had some cool manifestations in the 50s as Ivan Rasputin and then the Wild Bull, the Pompous, and all of this stuff. His career with the Sheik, Eddie Farhad in Detroit. To see them like this, and a lot of guys didn't have money, and they were killed. The fact they didn't have health insurance, there was no Keogh, Roth IRAs, nothing, no pensions. So a few guys like Bruno and Thez, but a lot of guys pissed away their fortune. All you got to do is look at Dr. Jerry Graham. We visited. Yohe went to his place. I did, and several others. He was living in it was maybe like 15 by 20 feet when he died at the crappy apartment in a bad part of LA. It was, awful. And he was in a wheelchair by then. But I will never forget him coming to our 1996 Cauliflower Alley, sitting next to Ray Stevens. Tom Burke will remember this. And he was heckling Lou Thez on stage. So Jerry Graham, had what looked like $5 worth of clothes on him in a wheelchair right in front of Lou Thez on stage. And he's heckling Thez and screaming, "What about Frank Gotch? What about the, he actually was naming old time guys, Sonnenberg and et cetera at Thez, and Thez kind of really was just doing a slow boil. So,
well, and I'll say to that, I agree with you completely. And somebody pointed this out. I don't remember who it was I was talking to about it, but when you read the epilogue to the book, they said, a lot of these guys didn't meet very happy endings, and it's true. I think that holds true, through wrestling. You look at how Gorgeous George, went out and
what he did. This one. You didn't have this in the epilogue. I went zoned right in on there because I knew Cherie Dupree, who was his most famous, female valet and wife of the 2 or 3. But he invested a lot of money in a turkey burger ranch,
right?
I told you this, and it went bust. He was so ahead of his time, and at that point he had to beg. He begged Tunney to put him on the card with Whipper Watson to drop his hair, but he had Cherie drop the hair instead of him. But he finally agreed and needed that bone thrown at him against Dick Beyer, his very last match, hair versus mask, and he had the head shaved by Jimmy Lennon Sr., who sang at his funeral, and but died penniless, as you wrote. It just awful, and
a lot of and I think I don't know how much it's changed. I'm not sure. I think that's one of those things, and I should probably jump in a second, but I think that this idea that wrestling is fake in quotation marks, and that's kind of the perception a lot of people have of it. I think it causes them not to always see the wrestlers as real people. I think this has changed an awful lot. I mean, I'll talk more in like the 80s or so. So I think there was sometimes almost a lack of empathy, that you might have had empathy for a guy like, Brooks Robinson. A lot of people in baseball, Johnny Unitas, you look at these terrible endings. Some of them came through, their bodies were beat to hell, and the NFL didn't really care that much about him. But I think that was probably more epidemic in wrestling a little bit, just because they just weren't seen on the same par as other athletes. And maybe it's deserving of some of the protections that some of them may have had or not had, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think again, that started in the beginning, whereas I think, and it's the same in boxing, they got as much out of these guys as they could. And then the promoters moved on and the business moved on, and
you wrote about when the first year of TV, there was 65,000 sets. Gorgeous George helped sell and get that,
Georgie sets.
How many to 500, an amazing amount of TVs, and it was most likely due to Gorgeous George being on. Who was he? Was he on the Dumont Network, the Marigold Arena, Fred Kohler shows, or in terms of syndicated wrestling, the early days of TV, there was, I think Kohler was first or most famously, but Jules Strongbow had the shows from Santa Monica Civic, the Long Beach Auditorium. And then,
I want to say he was on Live from the Olympic. I'm not going to swear to that. I thought he was on Live from the Olympic, but honestly, Tim Hornbaker would probably know off the top of his head. I'm pretty sure that's what he was on, but I might be wrong about that.
And in that vast vault, when we were given the tour of Titan Towers in 1991 and 92, they had their video facility. This was WWF, Vince and Linda. They had their video facility maybe like 4 miles away from Titan Towers, 4-story Titan Towers. And they did not have a rich archive of Vince Sr.'s TV. They had this amazing thing, temperature controlled for all of the video and all of the video to current that they purchased. They now have a much larger facility. But they bought out all these TV, Bill Watts' first wife, ex-wife, who had all of the Mid-South, not the Universal UWF, for example, or the Fritz or the Gagne stuff, which they're not sharing with others. They're just like hoarding this stuff. But they have very few. They've maybe got some Lewin and Bastien Brothers stuff from Vince Sr.'s Capital Sports, but very little, which is crazy to think. Where is that footage?
It's crazy to think. It's absolutely crazy to think. I couldn't agree with you more.
Jonathan.
Yes. I was just sitting here thinking about it, listening to you guys. And I guess you two would be two guys I could bring this up with. And because we were talking money and everything else, and John mentioned about the business eventually moving on like it does, like life. And I've heard different arguments with this, but do you guys think with the current state of the business, and that's not what we're focusing on, folks, with, the TKO and how the business is now and AEW and all, could there be a union to protect these future generations of guys?
Mike, I'll let you. I have a thought, but Mike, you're an expert on this, I think, in the wrestling mindset. But what do you think?
All I know is I've interviewed and talked to JC Ventura on starting it and having Hogan stooge him off. I think Hunter, it's not owned by the McMahon family anymore. It's owned by TKO, which owns UFC and other, sports products, platforms, and tons of stuff globally. I don't know. I think Hunter, though, if you look at him now as the head of creative and running the show, would probably be more open not just because he was a wrestler, but maybe more open to that. He seems open to almost everything, even the possibility of, working with other promotions beyond TNA. You would hope that, but I don't know. I think they're doing things internally now to where you're not going to have that many Sasha Banks situations. Forget her real name.
Mercedes.
Yeah, Mercedes. I forget the last name. It's not Monet, but Money. But that'll crop up where they leave, or it wasn't so much a union thing, but it was about control over themselves. I don't know. I don't know if there's always going to be a need. I'm not saying there's not a need, but I don't know. I think Hunter's probably doing the best anyone has at, as well as Tony Khan for AEW, of taking care of the talent. They're not having to pay for their rental cars, their hotels, their surgeries at the Andrews, the best clinic in the world for athletes. When they have a torn rotator or pec or whatever. I don't know. John, you may have a better grasp of that. Go ahead.
No, I don't know if I do. I mean, the era I was thinking about with you is what you said is with Jesse Ventura. And I think Roddy Piper was involved in some of that too, of trying to get guys to unionize. I do think probably then in the mid 80s or so, they were still locked in the old school mindset, I think, of where wrestlers were like independent contractors. And, I wonder, and I don't know this at all, but I wonder if there was just not the desire to do it because they just didn't think of themselves that way. They were independent guys. They traveled around. They could jump from promotion to promotion if they wanted. They weren't locked into contracts, and they followed the money around, and they probably liked that. And that was their mindset. And they kept the secret. The business was kind of secretive, and, they were traveling around. It was a dangerous lifestyle. You were dealing with a lot of probably shady characters from time to time. I don't know now, as the people coming into the business as performers probably have extraordinarily different mindsets from what those guys had, I would bet. But again, I don't know that. So I would think.
Remember, they're not plucking them from indie shows or going around the country anymore. They're going to like ice skaters and former gymnasts, all of that NXT talent. The majority of them don't even have any wrestling background. They were just plucked and brought in almost the way 20 years ago Vampiro, or 40 years ago plus Billy Graham just grabbed from a gym.
Yeah,
Billy Graham in Billy's case.
So I don't know. I mean, I think it would have to, and I don't know how much they make, and I don't know how quick. I'm not sure how quickly they come and go. And I mean, I think it would have to get pretty bad for them to want to get together. I mean, you see this in other industries where, the corporation that's kind of controls it just cuts the employees to the bone to the point that they then try to get together because they've had enough. I don't know if it'll get to that point in wrestling. I think it was probably close in the 80s. I think they were working them to the point of breaking, in a lot of ways. And so that's probably why they got close then. I don't know if it's the same way anymore.
I want to bring up something that when I was putting my notes together and all about John and the book and everything else. Like I said in the introduction, he writes all kinds of pop culture things, but has done deep dives on things for Slam Wrestling. And I know the name Greg Oliver has been brought up a couple times here. But the one thing, and I'm going to have a link to all outlets of this because I thought it was a fascinating article, because for some odd reason, my parents wanted me to know how to read and write. Those bastards. But you did a deep dive of the original Reginald Siki for Slam Wrestling. And I don't know if there was any relation, but I know there was who took over the name Siki was Big Daddy Siki out of Toronto, the Next Generation. Well, first, was there any connection between the two? What can you say about the article itself?
I don't think there was a connection. I mean, the article on Reginald Siki, that was a blast to write. That took me about a year, but for people who don't know who he was effectively the first real black wrestler who was very well known. I mean, there were black wrestlers before him. They weren't quite as well known. They weren't quite as successful for different reasons, but he was the first one to really achieve pretty serious wrestling fame. And this was in the early 20s, well before some of the names people know, and they think of as the early, and those guys were pioneers for sure. Cause it's not like there was like a glut of black wrestlers. So, I mean, but he was really the first big one. and he worked for Billy Sandow. He worked for Jack Curley and some of the early, some of those promoters. He was wrestling in main events. He was wrestling for the heavyweight title. I want to say maybe not. I don't know if I actually did, because there were some issues back then. The white champions refused to wrestle black wrestlers, just like in boxing, they refused to fight. White boxers refused to defend their title against black boxers, and that happened in wrestling too. But he had a really successful career in the early, I'm not going to get my dates exactly right, but he left America, and I want to say 28, 29, and became a really well-known performer in Europe. And I want to say he wrestled Cola Quariani in front of like 70,000 people, like huge audiences. I haven't looked at the article in a little while, but ended up being a prisoner of war. And I think what interested me in his story is that story of him being a prisoner of war. And during World War II, he was captured by the Nazis and held in a camp there, not a concentration camp, but a prison. Was the fact that some people thought that story was worked. And it was, and to me, that said something about the depth of wrestling's work, shoot, whatever you want to call it, thing, that people would think this real story of a guy who really almost died in a Nazi concentration camp was just him making this up to promote himself. And I thought, God, that's so fascinating. And there's actual proof that would exist to show that he, there's a paper trail of him being in there. Anyway, he came back to America and rebuilt his life, had a career again, and ended up wrestling Gorgeous George at the Olympic, in one of his last matches. And he died, I want to say 46 or 48. I don't remember right this second, but died in Los Angeles. It's a fun read. I mean, if you get a chance, it's over at Slam Wrestling. And I'll put a plug in for one more piece I worked on.
Please do.
Was the history of what I call the Weston magazines, but a lot of people call the After magazines. And I wrote that for PopMatters, and would encourage anybody interested in that to look it up, because I was able to track down, Eddie Elner and Dave Rosenbaum and, Steve Farhood and all those guys, Craig Peters, and get them on the phone and talk with them and just really get the story of those magazines. Cause I've always had a lot of respect for those magazines, and I love them. I know they're not hard news, but they are entertaining as hell, I loved them. And those guys, that was their full-time job, was writing wrestling fiction, basically.
Fiction. We never called them the After mags. And Stan was my editor before Bill came in, and Bill took the magazines to another level, and the prestige and blah, blah, blah. But
and all love to Bill After. He's absolutely amazing, for sure.
Stanley, I got to honor him. I nagged him to come out to a CAC, his only one in Los Angeles. We were still there, and I got to honor him on stage, which was a big thrill for me, because he was the deal. He started, a lot of folks forget, he started Wrestling Review with that 1959 issue. A lot of color pages, color fold out, and the Graham brothers in color on the Eddie and Jerry on the cover, which was amazing.
He's amazing. He's hilarious, and I think just such a great spokesman for that era, because he saw it all and he wrote about it all, and it's just amazing. So
PWI is the only U.S. newsstand magazine. It went from, recently it was bi-monthly, now we're back to monthly, every single month, in supermarkets and stuff. Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and for a time, and they took the Wrestler Inside Wrestling and made it a joint issue about 10 years ago, where I had my Whatever Happened To, Where Are They Now column. And so we owe him a debt of gratitude. The only Japanese magazine left, Gong, went under due to a Yakuza scandal about 20 years ago. So Shukan Pro Baseball is the only monthly newsstand Japanese mag. There's the two British ones. And I don't think Triple Ace mag is alive in Mexico. It's still the old one from the 40s, Boxy Lucha, Boxing and Wrestling.
Yeah. So I would encourage people to look that up if they're interested. But yeah, thank you guys for your time. The book, just to put another plug out for it, but Ballyhoo for anybody who's interested. But please check it out. I hope it's fun. I hope it's not a dry read at all. I hope it brings that era to life for people, and kind of gives a new spin on some of these old names that people might just really only hear about here and there. So.
Wow. Jon Langmead, let me tell one thing I wanted to say is I encourage you to shop this. I'll nag you later on the next couple of months. Shop this as a screenplay, just on Curly's life alone. Maybe WWE could front their production company could
Please,
front.
If you know any names, pass them on. I'll do it.
Because I'm so visually oriented, and things you were writing about him in San Francisco and Chicago, and Gary Street, Market Street, Van Ness Boulevard, all of these, things have been around forever. and wrestling policemen like John Swensky for Roy Shire. You know, there were tough guys, former wrestlers that would still work in the office. Like Roy Shire had his policeman in case something happened. This guy could stretch, break joints.
Oh, so you're not talking to Big Boss Man in the late 80s, early 90s?
A little different.
Former
He
NWA.
was great. He was great too.
He promoted San Jose for Roy Shire for many, many years, and also did for years Roy's program. He had no editorial writing background, but he did these tremendous programs from Roy from 1961 on until about 1970. So again, Ballyhoo is an amazing book. The Roughhousers, con artists, Wildmen who invented professional wrestling. 5-star review. Your last name is spelled Langmead. First name Jon. Go get it on Amazon everywhere. Or do you have some other platforms, social media you'd like to plug?
Just my name. People can find me out on the social media. I don't do a whole lot out there, but I'm around.
Well, John, thank you so much for the time, sir.
Thank you for your time. Have a great rest of the day, y'all.
What a great, amazing book. More power to you. Thank you, John.
Hey there, Friday fans. We know how much you enjoy the movies. Enjoy grabbing your Friday merchandise and interacting with the Friday family, whether it be at conventions or during our particular watch-alongs. Well, when you're looking to get yourself masks, why not check out our friends over at Camp Blood Customs out of New York State and order your specific custom mask from any of the films. All orders are made specifically. Your needs and wants are. Make sure you find Camp Blood Customs on Facebook, Instagram, and all over social media and order yours today.
Hi, this is Joyce Poshchin, AWA Pro Wrestling author. You're listening to Crazy Train Radio, home of all things pro wrestling and pop culture. Enjoy.